All right, I want to pick up where I left off last time. Let me get a share screen going. I had started to talk about texture sheet animation, and I was having some difficulty. The reason being I was trying to drop textures into the slot rather than materials. So texture sheet animation, I've got a bunch of them here. The particle or the material that I'm using here is a particle flames. And the particle flames has a texture, and that's where my problem originated, has a texture that has this checkerboard grid of different pictures of flames in different states. And for texture sheet animation, what we need to do is specify that we're working from a grid, and I have to set the width and height of that texture grid. So there were 8 across and 4 rows down, and so I need to tile it as 8 by 4. And what you can see over here is that over the lifetime, and here's the lifetime, my particle is going through the different pictures that are contained in that checkerboard texture. And I've got a couple of them here. This is one that for a fireball. There's one here that has sort of flames licking. There's one that's kind of a cloud that an explosion, say. And here's another explosion and a 2-frame spark. And just to show you that some of the prefabs, the flames one, which is from the standard assets, it too uses a texture sheet animation. In fact, it uses the same one that I mentioned. It does more particles. So if I play this, and let me maximize. If I play this, I'm seeing my different particles. This one all the way on the left is the complex flames. Then I have one that's cycling, and these cycle through their lifetimes. There are other settings that you can do. For instance, if we change this to frames per second, then every frame that the renderer does, it switches to a different cell or a tile in the checkerboard. So that's texture sheet animation. And it's a very interesting one. So let me turn these off. Now another one that I kind of skipped over was the triggers. And the triggers turn out to be a little more complex and require some scripting. So here's a trigger one. And in this trigger one, I'm also including a mesh renderer. So when my particles are emitted, they're meshes instead of particles. And this is done down in the renderer where I specify a mesh. The render mode is mesh. I'm going to render a sphere mesh, and I've put a red material on it. And these things then bounce. The other thing that I've done with this is I've got a a subemitter. I haven't talked about subemitters yet. I will in a minute. And this subemitter triggers whenever it collides with anything. So my collision is with world, and I've got a subemitter on collision. It produces this splat from mesh, which itself is just a red particle that fades to invisible. And this one, instead of being just a billboard, is a horizontal billboard, which means it stays flat on the ground where the thing is produced. So each of these things, when they bounce, they produce one of these little red spots where they bounce. Now, the trigger system is a little more complex. So I have here a collider, and we'll talk more about colliders when we get to physics. But this collider is set to be is trigger, and we'll see what that means when we get to colliders. And this has on it a script, trigger script, and this thing, this trigger script, has a UI element. We're going to talk about them later, a text type. It has a particle system that we use a get component on. All of this I'll explain in much, much more detail later. But the point is that the on particle trigger function that is called when the particle system trigger enters that collider, I trigger a callback. And this callback is going to trigger that script. Now, one other thing I have to do down here is in the on collision, I have to ensure that collision messages are sent. This is important for this. So we'll talk about the scripting later, but suffice it to say that this thing is keeping track of every ball that goes through this trigger collider, which is just a big cube whose mesh renderer I've turned off. It's just a mesh renderer that's turned off with its box collider set to be its trigger. So the point of this script is that every time a particle enters, it's loaded into this list called enter. We have a list up here. And I increment the count by the number that have entered. And this is displayed on that UI text. So each of these particles that are nice balls that are bouncing when they collide with the world and leaving us flat behind is being counted up here in my UI element that's counting them. Triggers are a little tricky, I agree with you. So the next one I want to show you is lights and trails. Lights, we get to add a light to our particle. We have this ratio, which is the fraction of particles that get a light. If it's 1, they all do. If it's 0, none of them do. And so I've got here a little snow system. Let me turn this off and turn the snow system on. And the snow system, the particles here, where are the snow system here. Whoops, sorry about that. Let me turn off the mesh trigger system. So the snow system is a whole bunch of particles that rain out of a circle. Our shape here is a big circle that's overlooking my world. It's overlooking my world. So my snow system is this big circle. My particles are originating within that circle. They all have a little gravity that's pulling them down. And the particles have some noise to make them kind of jiggle. And they have trails. Where's the trails? They have trails. The trails, there are a number of different choices here, one of which is particles. Again, the ratio, how many of them get trails, what the lifetime of the trail is. This is like the trail renderer that we talked about before, a texture which has to be added down here in the renderer. We have to put a trail material in the renderer. So we're seeing these trails of the different particles. Now, I'm going to talk about sub-emitters in a minute, but this one also has the sub-emitter. On death, they make the red particle, and on collision, they make the green particle. I mentioned that they had lights. The lights are here, where I've got one of my prefabs, a blue light. The blue light has a kind of short range, 3 meters. It's blue, it's fairly intense. And so the particles, when they're bouncing on the ground, have this light effect going on. So we can run this and see this happen. Our snow is falling out of the sky. As they hit the ground, they make these green particles on the collision. And when they die, they're going to make the red particle. So a snowstorm that builds up snow and uses noise, uses a bunch of other methods. So trails and lights. Custom data I won't talk about, that's a hard one. So let me go back to the sub-emitters. And the sub-emitters, a very powerful module that enables the spawning of other particle systems at the various events that occur with our different particles. Trigger is that event that I talked about before. We won't deal with that, but the 3 primary ones are on birth, on collision, and on death. So let me turn off the snow and turn on my kind of primitive little fireworks here. So with the fireworks, my fireworks, I've got a little cone emitter that's firing these particles. And as the particles go through their lifetime, they're spawning these little green trails behind them. This is not a trail, but it's a series of particles that are emitted as a function of distance. When those green ones die, there's a yellow spark, and when the primary particles die, they emit the blue particles that have a little trail renderer on them. Now, one of the nice things about Unity, first of all, let me very quickly just show you a trick that has to occur with this. I'll make a new particle system, and I'll just leave it alone with what it's doing. But down here with the SubEmitter, well, let me make another particle system, a second particle system. I'll call it, well, I'll leave it at that name. And this one, I'm going to make its emission not something that happens all the time, but a burst of 30 particles that happens once with 100% probability at time 0. And just for the heck of it, I'll make this a sphere. I'll make the sphere kind of small, and the particles are just going to burst out of that sphere. Now with this particle system, I'm going to set the lifetime down kind of small so they don't last very long, maybe 3. So the particles don't last very long. And under SubEmitter, I'll turn SubEmitters on, and on death, I'm going to start this particle system. Now watch what happens here. It says, do you want to reparent it? I'll say yes, and if you watch over here, what happens is this particle system 1 becomes a child of particle system. And this is where we're making not just particle systems, but particle effects. These are a collection of systems into one effect that is a particle effect. Now, another nice thing about the particle effect is that I can open an editor that shows all the different components of my little particle effect. I've got the particle system, the kind of root, and then here I have the child, and I can edit these. This is a dockable window, and I can put it someplace nice. And over here, we're seeing any of the curves that we edit in any of the different systems. And I can kind of focus attention on the different parts of this and see just the one that I want to deal with. This is a particle effect. I'm going to close that window. So that's the editor that edits that particle system. So as these particles die, they're spawning this great set of particles. Let me just instantiate 5 of these instead. That's a little more reasonable. And I'll change its color to red so that you can definitely see that these are other particles that are being spawned. So here I am in the world. The little particles are spraying up in the air. When they die, they spawn those red particle systems, and presto, we have a particle effect by using SubEmitters. I'm going to turn that off and go back to my snow. So my snow has SubEmitters. On death, it's making a red. On collision, it's making a green. And so, and the particles have lights and trails and noise modules. And we're seeing the various green ones. By the way, these splat particles, I'm using a horizontal billboard for. As the particle dies, it turns into a red particle, and everything's very cool. So texture sheet animation, lights, trails, sub-emitters, and finally the renderer. I've referred to the renderer here in a number of different places. The renderer's module settings determine what the particle image is. As I mentioned, we have the option of emitting meshes like spheres and cubes and things like that. We have a material that is the material that's on the particle. If we happen to have trails, we have a trail particle material that we have to define. Sorting has to do with transparencies, how things are transparent in front of each other. The billboard settings include horizontal billboards that I showed you, also a vertical billboard. The vertical billboard always faces the camera, but instead of rotating to always be perpendicular to the camera the way an ordinary billboard does, it will always stay upright. It will always face the camera. Stretched billboard is something that lets a particle kind of stretch along its direction of motion. You can see an example of that in one of the particle systems. I believe it's the sparks here, where it's the flare. The flare, its renderer, no, the sparks, its renderer uses a stretch billboard where there's a speed scale and a length scale, and this makes these little spark particles stretch along the direction that they're moving. So the little sparks, instead of being a point, become a little line. We have the choice of casting shadows, and the rest of this we can pretty much leave at the defaults. So the different modes: billboard, horizontal billboard, vertical billboard, and stretched billboards, as well as the option of rendering meshes. Here are the different options. There are quite a few of them here. And so lastly, the particle effects, which is the assembly of these different particles into individual entities by childing the different effects to them. And by the way, these don't need to necessarily be children of each other. Here is the fire complex, which actually doesn't even have a particle system on its root. It's just a complex of different particle systems that are all kind of gathered together in a single entity. And we can open the editor and, oops, not what I wanted. We can open the editor. I guess we can't, because the root here isn't the particle system. Fire Mobile, that's a better one. With Fire Mobile, we can open the editor, and we see all of the different effects or the systems that are part of this effect. So nice tool. We have the editor, we have the idea of a particle effect, building on our particle systems, the editor with all of its different curves. You can toggle between showing all and showing selected. This way we can kind of see just one part of the effect and not all of the effect. And of course, we have this tool here that lets us do things with our system, slowing down time, and uh, uh, recognizing how many particles are in existence and how many sub-emitters and what the speed range of our particles is. We can pause that, restart it, stop it. And this is a handy tool as we build these particle systems. So I think that finishes what I'm going to do with particles here. I'm going to stop sharing. I'll come back in maybe with some demos of some other stuff. So I'm going to stop recording. I'll see you all in class. Bye.